All right. So, welcome everybody. Welcome today. Sending love to you. I'm here today with Jacob Kishere, wonderful man, friend of mine. We've been involved in different transformational spaces together. Jacob is a multi passionate writer, artist, podcast host, leader of men's work, Socratic dialogue practitioner, and I would say a philosopher. So awesome to have you on the show today, brother.
Awesome to be here, brother. Yeah.
And
I've
also a
been
rapper, I should say.
yeah. Yeah, thank you for throwing that in too. Much thanks to your influence and impact on that journey the last few years. And also I've been in a weird kind of time wave the last few days where I'm like feeling very close to being in Italy last July, where we linked up and toured around and rapped and visited the Vatican. and for me, though, something about that whole situation just expressed a lot of what my highly unique relation to Christianity is. You know, the mixture of connecting with cannabis and also prayer and profound conversations and profane freestyles and all of that in together with you was tight. So
Yeah, that was an amazing time. And yeah, there's a lot of rich threads we could pull on there. I think the Christianity beyond itself topic has been really alive for both of us. And maybe that comes up later in this conversation. We'll see. But I think the topic we wanted to jump in on feels pretty ripe. And so I'm gonna start us there, and just wanted to open up this dialogue around polarization as a starting point, because this is a huge topic in the culture right now. Obviously, it's been freshly inflamed recently by various current events. Probably most notably in people's minds is the new Trump administration. There's a lot of polarization around that, but just generally, it feels really important at this moment as a culture to ask, how do we navigate polarization? How do we hold polarization? How do we how do we swim in those waters? How do we avoid becoming extremely polarized in ways that are detrimental? And how do we potentially play the liminal trickster who can diffuse the culture wars and kind of point toward higher syntheses? Those are some initial queries that ricochet around in my consciousness around this. I'm curious what comes up for you in relation to polarization at this time.
mm, yeah, this is a really poignant topic. It's been moving for me a lot the last couple of months, I'd say, as well. And it can be a very disruptive force in our lives. I think polarization is not um, specifically conceptual or simply about ideas or information. It's about how it lives in our nervous systems. It's about what happens when we come into a dialogue space where that energy of polarization is present. It's that feeling of anxiety. It's that, feeling of anxiousness in the pit of your stomach, or it's the feeling of like people getting really heated up and like, the things we call triggered, but like the escalation of like fight or flight um nervous system states in relation to conversations about things in the culture and in the infosphere. So I think it's very important as foundation to just kind of land that, the polarization conversation has to be rooted in an understanding of like what's going on in our bodies right now. And if we're attempting to have that conversation and you know, it's very easy to kind of slip into these polarized dialogues with people where actually one person has a highly activated nervous system and there's just not an acknowledgement of that, there's not a consciousness of that. And so this is where like the skills of like space making, dialogos, and various forms of what we would associate with sense making, like holding a space where we understand the context, the embodied context, is as relevant to the possibility of coming closer to truth, and ultimately having new realizations together, um, as is the content. And I think a lot of what gets lost, especially because of these like hyper almost disembodied information streams and flows, is we're just getting like these reinforcement loops of info that come in and compound and compound and compound and activate us. But that's not being landed in relational fields where there's intimacy and also inquiry. Um, so I think it's
When you say it's not being landed, can you clarify what you mean by that?
right. Because of the severity of the dynamics at play, there's a strong incentive to switch off, disengage, where the polarity presents in our lives. So if we have a family member who's become, polarized, or, in the sense of like, oh, this person's mode of participation has been heavily informed by the information they're taking in and then kind of like spitting it back out through what they're saying and what they're reposting and sharing and retweeting. And now like any engagement with them, you kind of are engaging with that energy. And so we just get blocked basically. And it's well, I want to set that aside for a moment, because the piece that's really been alive for me in relation to understanding this energetically is about excommunication, um, which is a primal fear that human beings have coded in us. It's what's regulated society. It's what's caused the persecution and sometimes death of dissidents and mystics and heretics for thousands of years. And it goes all the way down to the school playground. So I think this is something that's at play behind the polarization dynamics, um, in which certain groups within that sphere actually consciously or unconsciously are practicing a kind of like rejection, disassociation, not like, disassociating from yourself, more like, oh, this person expressed something that is on the wrong side of the polarity, therefore I cut off my relational connection to them. And so naturally that just creates a fear in our bodies of expressing what we're seeing and going in contra to the polarity that other people may be holding. Now I'm going to say something that actually takes me from talking about polarization into the field of polarity. Okay. So just noticing that shift. Um, from my standpoint, I think there is something in the more progressive uh, kind of polarization that seems to exemplify more of this excommunication energy, and also this sense of untouchable, can't associate with this person, etc. And this is what people are talking about with cancel culture, to some degree as well. So, we don't want to fall on the wrong side of that. And that creates this energy of suppression or internalized suppression. And the problem is the people who are operating from that space of like, this is the good in group and that's the bad out group. And, you're going to be in a lot of trouble if you go in that bad out group, is those people are not perfect. They're not perfect sense makers. Their sense making is incomplete. They have strong biases. Their biases also arise from their value systems. They value things like compassion and empathy, more, they value inclusion. But then there's other virtues that get lost, like exclusion, exclusivity, boundaries, um, justice, relative to compassion and things like that. So those people's viewpoints are incomplete. They get things wrong, and then another group of people will emerge on the other side of that. And I think part of the dynamic at play with the more counter progressive cultural movements is there's a little bit of like a fuck you kind of like reactive, like I'm done suppressing myself energy, and then it almost becomes like this memey, like it's like there's a slight like non-sincerity, like a slight memey, like almost ironic posture that then comes in the counter that also isn't very helpful either.
When is exclusion or exclusivity a virtue? I think that's a question many people would immediately have.
Yeah, that's a great question. All the way down to biological chemistry. You think about cells and membranes. Like there's these membranes around things which protect and define what is inside and what is outside. And the integrity of a good membrane actually allows relationship to occur. So lots of cells with healthy membranes can come together with other cells and create complex organisms and so on and so forth. Um, if a community has a set of values, um, then there's a kind of membraning around that prevents those values from completely falling apart. E.g., like stealing is outside of the domain of what's included in that. So if there's going to be a hard boundary you come up against if you try and steal, for example. And if that boundary falls apart, then it can actually undermine the internal coherence and structure. So that would be one way of thinking about it. I think at the level of groups, I often think exclusivity is associated with excellence. So if you want an educational institution to exhibit excellence, it has to select for people who are exhibiting the potential for excellence. If you want a sports team to function at the highest level so that it can beat all the other sports teams and win competitively, it needs to select for excellence in sporting capacity. If you want a government, if you want a military, if you want a rock band, there's a degree of exclusivity required in that. And all of this is rooted in the idea that competence exists, that it's possible to move from lower levels of ability to higher levels of ability in reality, um, i.e., hierarchies of competence are meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the work that we do with men or in terms of healing work, that's another good example. Like if you think about an ayahuasca healing center, if a bunch of people are going there to heal, it's like you want to have a group of people who are all coming with a really sacred intention to do deep work. You don't want anyone in that space who's just like, "Oh, hey, are we gonna take some drugs and party in the jungle, bro?" Like, or you don't want somebody in that space who's just like, "Oh, I don't even know what ayahuasca is. I'm just here to drink this vodka or something." It's like, obviously, that's gonna be disruptive to the context that's being cultivated. So there are a lot of specific contexts in life that benefit greatly from a certain amount of cultivation and curation where certain elements are invited and certain elements are implicitly or explicitly excluded. And in the context of um, men's work and transformational containers, you know, part of part of why it's a good idea usually to charge money for this type of stuff is that money is one of the easiest ways to immediately exclude pretenders and people who aren't serious. And others might say, "Oh well, but money also excludes just people who don't have money." And that's true, and oftentimes there's scholarships. I mean, a lot of this work, there's scholarships and there's very accessible ways, but the money, it's not just about excluding people who don't have money, it's about excluding people who aren't really ready to commit and show up and do the work, because if you create free containers, and I've observed this myself, free containers can be really valuable for people, but you're gonna get, in general, a much more kind of wishy-washy cast of people who are like, "Oh, maybe I'll dip my toes into this, maybe I'll show up for a minute." Whereas, like, when you charge men 100, $200 a month on a monthly basis to dig into men's work, that's enough that they feel usually, invested, committed. They're gonna show up, they're gonna attend the sessions, they're gonna practice, try to apply what they're learning outside the sessions, they're gonna try to order their life, clean up their life, work toward their visions because they're investing in the modality, so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and people see that as very clear. If you pay for a gym membership, symbolically, that usually leads to more showing up to the gym, and various other contexts. Education, for example, you also pay for tuition often. But just also to like include the counterpoint, like inclusion is also very important. This is more like the feminine divine mother kind of virtue in a sense. It's like all is included within the love of the mother. So once you have the proper boundary around the container, then within that, it's more possible to create a space of maximal inclusion, I think, because you've created the conditions of commitment and safety. Uh, in order that like different parts can start to be integrated, and we can really like see each other for all the different dimensions. Whereas if the boundary was um less clearly delineated, then it's difficult to actually go to that depth of work and inclusion. um you know uh, Diversity of various varieties is very important in this work too, because there are intersections that each of us carry generationally, culturally, nationally, racially, and so on, that we just otherwise don't necessarily have in the space, and those can like activate new realizations and new processes to unfold as well. So that's super important. And I'm not saying all exclusive spaces and hierarchies are good. Like there's a lot of those that are kind of corrupt, and they become clubs that are kind of like self-perpetuating of their own mindset. And a lot of the failure of the kind of diversity and inclusion movement, from my standpoint, was that you had all of these infrastructures, whether it was media institutions or political class or things like that, and they would just kind of like bring people in who fit the bill, e.g., they were racially diverse or something like that. But they just brought them into the same mindset, the same ontology, the same way of being and seeing the world, and perpetuated that. So often the shadow of like diversity, equity, inclusion advocates is that it's just focused on these visible characteristics of like disability, skin color, sex, and things of this nature. And it's not actually about profound diversity of perspective and ways of sensing and ways of relating, and different kinds of minds and things like that.
Yeah, a couple things that come up. Number one, I like that you mentioned inclusion and brought in the counterpoint there, because what it brought up for me was just this feeling and what feels like a recognition that there's this cosmic container that we're all in that is truly all inclusive, and we're all held in this container of pure beingness. And on the level of our beingness, we are equal. We're ontologically equal. That's kind of the sense in which all men are created equal. We're all held equally by this cosmic container of beingness. And one of my great, inspirations in life is to help more people actually feel and know that they are held by this cosmic Christ, this cosmic container of beingness, however you want to, conceive of that. And so there's this, universal inclusion, this universal love of the mother. And then within that, though, yeah, I like that you brought in the example of cells and just pointing out that it's just very natural in nature for there to arise unique kind of training grounds that are specifically geared toward cultivating particular capacities and particularly geared toward calling a certain type of person into that environment. And that's beautiful as well. It's beautiful to like find specialized training environments for certain capacities. And it's beautiful to aspire to excellence in different areas where we have natural proclivities. I think one of the shadows of our culture and probably I'll just say our culture in general. I think one of the shadows is that there's almost been a demonization of excellence, or maybe it's like just a reactivity around excellence, where you see so many people who would just rather become haters, let's say, and sit on the court side and kind of throw stones at anyone who's trying to become excellent in some capacity, or who's actualizing their will or their power in some capacity. There's almost this, there's been this cultural undercurrent that kind of wants all of us to just like become this whitewashed kind of monotone, milk toast soup uh of you know equally mediocre people who are just kind of, I don't know, playing the same game. I don't know if I'm articulating that very well, but there's something in the culture that is like anti-excellence. It's kind of like this force that's like anti this kind of Ayn Randian individualism. I don't know that much about Ayn Rand, but my general understanding is that her view was kind of like supportive of this idea that, yeah, excellent individuals should be excellent, and, cultivate yourself, and it's beautiful to be an individual striving for excellence. So anywho,
Yeah.
that's a
No.
few things that come up
No,
there.
I think you articulated that really well, and I actually did a podcast and a little study of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. She's caricatured partly because there's a conservative think tank named after her as just like this political voice, but she's actually an incredible writer, and the way that the philosophy is woven into the fiction is quite profound. And yeah, I would say broadly, she exhibits the view that excellence is important, and that when this cultural movement that resents excellence and basically characterizes all excellence as a consequence of corruption, um, it can lead to the unraveling of society. And she talks about it in very like acute detail, like how little things start to fall apart at the local level. The trains stop working, the delivery systems start to fall apart. And so there's this sense of just like the very fabric of society itself is at stake when you let the kind of shadow of equality go too far. And it's not about eliminating one or the other. I think it's about dialogue and dialectic. It's like, there's virtue in one and there's virtue in the other, and we need to like have dialogues and think it through together. Try and find balance.
Yeah, one thing that comes up for me is that I feel like a potential solution or higher synthesis is just for people to really understand that point, that we're ontologically equal. We're all made of the cosmos. We're made of this beingness. We're made of this miraculous substance, whatever this is. And to just, for everyone to understand that every child, I really feel in a profound sense, every child is a genius, and every child has certain capacities that no one else has. And if they cultivate those capacities, they can become excellent in whatever they are a genius in, whatever their zone of genius is. And to me, it just seems like that's the best of both worlds where we can deeply acknowledge that in the deepest, most foundational sense, no one is above or below anyone else. We're we're ontologically equal, um, and at the same time, we're not all the same. There's this immense diversity, and we all have these unique capacities. And can we celebrate our unique capacities and encourage each other to, you know, cultivate those capacities and pursue excellence within our zone of genius? And to me, that's most likely to result in wiser, more beautiful futures, because then we've got, you know, people who are respecting all of life and they're cultivating their unique capacities and feeling full permission to do so.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, so taking it back to polarization a bit, we we didn't go too much yet into how to really hold polarization or how to navigate that. How are you within yourself holding the cultural polarization right now? And how are you navigating that and playing in and around polarized spaces to maintain your own sanity and to potentially drop seeds or nuggets that could assist with depolarization and creating more room for dialogue?
Think my starting place with the dialogue itself is, you know, inspired a lot by David Bohm, um, who was a quantum physicist and a student of Oppenheimer, who later had a lot of dialogues with the mystic J. Krishnamurti later in his life. And Bohm wrote this work on dialogue inspired by the work he was doing, which basically proposed that the dialogue itself could create a microcosm of the society. And if you could hold it in the right way, in a kind of non judgmental exploration that just stays with the unfoldment of it, then you could kind of see some of the polarizations emerge within the group and like allow it to kind of move and be digested within this kind of wholeness. So from that, I take that we actually need, as I spoke to before, like space making is really key to this. Um, and that is about creating a context of wholeness within which to start to presence the fragmentation. But if we go straight to fragmentation, it's very hard to get there. If there's a sense of a sacred ground or a sense of kind of collective value, I think that's sort of what we're looking for in terms of a ground. And there's various ways people try to do this. Um, Often, like the kind of like parent-child relationship is something that's appealed to at various times. Like we all have children, we all want our children to be safe and healthy, kind of thing. So that has been one, but that can also, you know, have its failure points. The nation, like we are all Americans, that's been an example of like a container, but also subject to a lot of difficulty right now. And then I think there's what you and I are often work with, which is like trying to just invoke the sacred ground of reality itself. Like we are all inside of divinity. And, you know, invoking and working from a connection to that, I think is the level at which we need to work now. Because a lot of those lower level sources of group coherence are so contested, right? So that would be the first and foundational piece. Um, I think there's an interesting dance and tension that I'm holding, that I'm working through a lot, talking with Matthew Green, my co-founder of Resonant Man, which is the dance between being a facilitator and being a, you know, a unique channel for reality, let's say. And like, I'm personally trying to work out how those roles fit together, because as a facilitator, my role is really to like be with whatever's happening, and hold a space of non-judgment, and ultimately be fundamentally concerned with the wholeness of the space and the awareness of the field, and like feeling like, oh, is there a fragmentation occurring, like something's come up that's so dense or intense that people are actually like splitting off energetically from participating in a shared space, and then how to like delicately like name that so that we can bring it from an unconscious dynamic of polarization into like the middle of the space, and therefore it's like within the field again. um and also, being able to just like stop and breathe and let those things move and be held. um and then with respect to fields and space making, also having containers that are long term, like not expecting that you're going to deal with the difficulty of polarization with a completely like just pulling together a bunch of rando people who don't necessarily have the commitment and skills to hold that. Whereas if you have a devoted field that's showing up regularly, that's maybe worked through different contexts, then I think that's the context in which we stand the best chance of holding it. But, you know, I'm not some neutral third person observer. I am a participant in this, and I've carved my own way through the polarities of the age, and I carry those with me, and so I have to like find ways to articulate that and bring that forward, because there's like truth. There's fragments of the truth that I personally carry and that are a consequence of my experience of my journey through a polarized world. And then there's fragments of truth that the other person carries. And then we have this meeting point of like, oh, fuck, like we seem to be in different realities right now. And what is the disposition that's going to allow that to actually progress? I think it's an orientation towards the sacred, towards maintenance of connection and relationship, authentic relating and kind of resonant dialogue, like including the embodied experience, including the awareness of the field in the process of dialoguing around it. And then I think we have actually a kind of work of integration, and there's a lot of almost presentism going on right now, where we're just like so caught up in like the ticker tape nowness of like this, now this is happening, now this is happening, now this is happening. But actually, this is not this. This is sort of informed by everything that has come in the years prior. And so, in order to really talk about, I'm seeing this version of the Rorschach, and you're seeing this version of the Rorschach, and they're not matching, we need to kind of take the time and space to tell story and like tell our story, like really piece together, like, what did I perceive of the last 5 to 8 years of how this was developing? How has my view shifted? What's led me to arrive where I am now? And where have you been? And what are the pieces that have informed what you're seeing? And then I think we're in a much better position to understand. And just grounding that for context, like COVID, the kind of global event of COVID was a massive forking off point, and still very present with me, because I'm realizing where there's a big loss of relational coherence with people right now. Usually I can track back to, we had a completely different perspective and experience of the COVID phenomenon. And that for many people was like a revelation, a ripping off of many different veils of what they perceived around institutions, around who they trusted, where trust was broken in deep and fundamental ways. And so what I kind of want to do now is think about how to create that space in light of all the kind of intentions that I've spoken about of how to do that well. And then B, how to kind of do this like sense making storytelling process of like what's been your journey, what have you perceived that's led you to see how you see it now, and to do that together with a sense of like, you know, there's a future possibility of greater mutual understanding where we're not just like hitting this like point of intensified non-coherence together. That's what I think. That's probably the main things that are moving through my head right now.
Mm, beautiful. Yeah, a lot of amazing ideas there for working with polarization and processing it. Yeah, I feel like a big one for me has been just really, really trying to take in a lot of perspectives from the full range on the political spectrum, as well as people outside the political spectrum, people who couldn't be easily placed on the political spectrum, and just really trying not to fall into, you know, just like only listening to Ben Shapiro or only listening to Daniel Pinchbeck or something like that. Cause I think that to point to just something, you know, simple and easy to understand, I think that that's a huge piece of how we end up in this hyper polarized culture war is that people, without realizing it, they just form an allegiance to a particular set of creators or speakers or news programs, and they just, you know, only absorb those signals, and it's just like confirmation bias. It just self reinforces this reality tunnel until they really cannot see outside of that, and anyone who is outside of that seems like a threat. And especially when they start making a lot of these ideas about politics or society a deep part of their identity, then it really becomes like, oh, anyone who's outside of that is a direct threat to
Mm.
me. And I feel like I'm literally like, I feel threatened, like I'm my very identity, my very being, like I'm going to die or something if I, you know, associate with these people who are like dynamite to my deeply internalized identity structure. So it's like a self-induced hypnosis that is algorithmically amplified and accelerated due to, you know, the algorithms tending to just feed us more and more of the type of content that we've been consuming. and and yeah, it's crazy how hard it really is to get out of this, because even just recently I came to the recognition that I had been in general listening to a larger preponderance of signals, um, like of a certain nature. And I just noticed like, oh, I've actually started to become kind of hijacked by these signals toward a certain way of perceiving what's happening globally and what's happening with politics. And then I counterbalance that by just like deliberately seeking out a bunch of cogent, well-researched, grounded, you know, takes from the other side or people who disagreed with that reality tunnel, and that acted as kind of an antidote that brought me back more into a space of just kind of like um quantum epistemology, like kind of holding all these different threads and all these different possibilities, and not collapsing down into, you know, one particular reality tunnel. But that's not easy to do. Like we're talking about a pretty advanced cognitive skill set to be able to navigate that. And it's a continuous practice, a continuous requirement of awareness, because it's so easy to start to slip into it. And sometimes it sneaks up on you. You don't even realize that, like, your new favorite podcast has a pretty substantial bias toward one particular narrative, and then before you know it, you're kind of hypnotized into that narrative, so that's very tricky.
Mm, yeah, I want to double click and draw a big circle around what you just said about the identification with it and the attachment to it and the sense of a loss that is involved with letting go of it, like it is in some sense a part of ourselves, like that it becomes an extended part of who we are. And I do think it's very rare what you've exhibited, like this, like I'm gonna say what I'm perceiving and, hit the hornet's nest head on in doing so, but then B, to actually take that and go on a kind of learning quest. Like, it's a rare ability, and I think it's probably a consequence of the fact that you've swum in so many psychic waters and moved between different religious systems, and, like, most of our patrimony, most of our inheritance has been to be a part of one way of seeing the world and to sit into it, religiously. But the benefit, perhaps, of that was that it was rooted in the sacredness and a sense of, being children of the divine. And so there was a deeper point of identity than the political. Whereas what we have now is most people in the Western world being disconnected from a sacred identity, but still enacting out a kind of religious tendency towards finding the good and true viewpoint and contra to, you know, a bad and untrue viewpoint, and then to like feel good about like voicing and sharing that and propagating that. So it's super difficult. I think, I'm as vulnerable to that as anyone else. Um, Albeit with the caveat that the kind of spaces and practices I've been drawn to with respect to dialogos, which is always about kind of getting beyond one's thinking and going to the edge of not knowing, and also the liminal web itself as this network of thinkers who are um, understanding us to be in a time between worlds where we're moving between perspectives and integrating different perspectives and learning to kind of flow with uncertainty. Like that helps a lot. And one of the beauty of the liminal web field is there are people of both polarities are represented and in dialogue there. But for me, ultimately, where it happens is in close relationships. It's when a friend or a romantic partner, like when it becomes apparent that the polarity is there, and it's like, well, I'm not going to let this sabotage my relationship. So I'm going to actually have to contend with this. And there's a sense of like, we're both in this together. There's no like easy, like, oh, I'm just going to unfollow type move. And it's not like, oh, it's those fuckers over there. It's like, no, it's somebody you love. And so then you're actually compelled to, okay, I'm going to really put on your binoculars and see the world as through your lens fully. And in so doing, my vision becomes stereoscopic, and I have two lenses, and maybe one of them is still feeling more uh closer to the truth. But at least I have that other lens. That other lens isn't this other thing like over there that I can't even fathom like seeing through. It's like right here. So that's the process I've been in recently, with respect to polarization and with respect particularly to the Trump administration and what's moving there. And yeah, it's not easy. There's a lot of like parts of me that are like, don't want to do that because it feels more comfortable to be in the space that feels aligned with how I already think. And I'm dispositionally drawn to one rather than the other. So
Yeah, for me, this underscores like a really crucial meta point about the whole polarization around Trump, which is that, there's tons of people who are just vehemently opposed to everything he's doing. And they're, you know, I mean, really like can be very vicious, can be very hostile. It's like it is its own kind of religion. That was something else that came up for me as you were speaking, is that the way I see the world, or a valuable way to see the world, I would say, is that everybody has a religion, whether they admit it or not. Everybody worships, as David Foster Wallace put it. And he noted that basically anything that you worship other than the great beyond, or, the highest supreme values of the great religions, will pretty much eat you alive. And so it becomes really important in human life to get clear on, what am I worshiping? What is my most basic relationship with reality? What are my values? Because if you're not clear on that, if you don't know what your religion is, then you're still going to have a religion. It's just not going to be a conscious religion. And I think for a lot of people in our kind of post God is dead, kind of strangely nihilistic, confused meaning crisis era, a lot of people are really grappling with like the shell of religion and the hollowing out of a lot of those meaning systems and what those seem to mean. And a lot of people then, without realizing it, grasp onto politics and create a new religion out of politics, that hooks in on very deep levels and becomes, a very foundational identity. So, anyway, my point was going to be that even if even if these people are right, even if the people are right who are like so vehemently opposed to everything Trump does, and who cannot see a single redeeming factor, cannot see anything that might be potentially auspicious or could have a decent outcome, even if those people are right, they're still they're still in a way wrong about the way they're approaching the whole thing. Because by completely demonizing anyone who sees any redeeming factor in Trump, and by com- evidencing a complete inability to look through the other person's binoculars and have any degree of fluidity to empathize with where others are coming from, they're embodying a total lack of what may be one of the single most valuable skills or meta skills that is going to allow us to even continue existing as a species into the far future. If we don't learn how to occupy viewpoints other than our own and look through the other binoculars and deeply empathize and see why and how and where people have arrived at those conclusions, and be able to put that lens on to the extent that we can actually genuinely deeply empathize and actually genuinely deeply feel and understand why people are seeing the world that way, and even be able to empathize with the highly polarizing figures themselves. I mean, I would say we have to be able to occupy the life world of, the worst people in human history, the generally agreed upon worst people in human history, and we have to be able to actually within ourselves discover the potentiality for those same expressions of humanity, and we have to be able to actually have compassion, find compassion and find empathy for even, the least among us and the worst among us, and see like, oh, this is probably how that person got that way. There's like a lot of pain there. And, I can kind of see how that might warp a person in this direction, or I can relate to them. So anyway, I don't know if everyone needs to go to that level of extreme kind of shadow work of exploring the deepest dark potentialities of mankind in themselves, but generally the point is that this capacity to fluidly empathize across party lines is, like, invaluable and probably essential for realizing the better timelines and the better angels of our nature versus, plunging into really dark dystopian timelines. So, yeah, people need to understand that even if maybe your opinion's right, but if you're not empathizing, then you're still, in a sense, really missing the mark because we've gotta be able to see through the other's eyes.
Yeah, I think just, you know, thank you for what you've just said. I think it's a really important, elevated, um, pertinent perspective. And that's kind of a foundational working principle for me is like to be able to find a position of relationality and a common field of love um, with people. And I would say very firmly if your mission to make the world a better place involves cutting off empathy and compassion for large swathes of your fellow human beings, then it's probably not on track. Um, yeah, I mean, I want to just to kind of point a little bit to that deep shadow work that you spoke to, like this reference point of fascism is has become kind of it's reached a saturation point in the last 10 years. Obviously, earlier, you think about George Bush Sr. and calling Saddam Hussein Hitler, and there's just been this kind of like poverty of historical nuance in which the only foundational story we have is like the Nazis were the bad guys of history and we beat them in war. And anything that looks like that trajectory is what we avoid. But then it's like history is such a nuanced, multi-dimensional story in which evil and good can arise in so many different contexts, not the least of which is the left-wing forms of authoritarianism that I- we're thoroughly impoverished and bound to become delusional if all we can draw upon is that. But more deeply, like as you spoke to actually heal the past, I believe we have to come to a place of compassion and understanding towards the people that we're branding as outside of the domain of compassion. And right now, the narrative is saying the um, the German who's orphaned, who is orphaned by the First World War and grows up in the Great Depression in Germany and becomes wrapped up in nationalist socialist ideology and then becomes anti-Semitic and then becomes recruited into the army and then in the midst of war becomes enrolled in participating in a genocide. Like our foundational view is still that that person is exempt from compassion and understanding. And that creates a massive blind spot for us because that person is us in a different context and situation. And we risk a real failure of understanding when we focus only on the victims of history and empathizing and compassion and condemnation of the oppressors, when actually we need to understand the oppressor and the victim inside of us. So, in other words, we need to try and understand and find compassion for our enemies whilst also honoring the difference of values that may require us to have boundaries with them. and also recognize that we too are prone to and have the potential to enact the same kinds of things that we're condemning as the other and demonizing as the other and saying those people over there are the ones that are doing that, and we're not doing any of that. Um, and so, yeah, it's difficult to do that in the present, but when we can do it historically, I think it puts us in good standing. And that's why the collective healing work is so valuable, because it's not us, it's our ancestors. And our ancestors were the victims and the oppressors. And, both lives in us. Had a dialogue with a woman who's some of her ancestors were slaves and some of her ancestors were slave owners, So she had to really hold both of those within her. And we all have the possibility of holding those polarities within us. And that, I think, will be enough to allow us to not just turn a political conversation into this kind of bullshit, like everybody in consensus about Trump being a fascist, and no more nuance than that. And it's just, there's a poverty of dialogical and philosophical skill in the culture writ large. Our education systems don't serve it. Our media systems don't serve it. And as a consequence, many conversations are simply just perpetuating what we already think and know, rather than seeking to scratch and understand and come into more full perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just strange that people get so locked into one narrative and they can't even see other possibilities. Like, just for example, a simple possibility that, hey, the United States is $36 trillion in debt. It's arguably been declining for decades. Its political system has not been functioning well. It's mainly locked in a state of gridlock where nothing gets done, and there's an enormous bloated bureaucracy that is not functioning well. Maybe, just maybe, some kind of iron-willed, leadership from someone who's just willing to cut through the bullshit and just get shit done, employing some unorthodox means. Maybe that's a needed disruption. Maybe that opens up potentials that end up going in really miraculous and beautiful directions. And you know, maybe historically, when people look at whatever that was with a measure of nuance, they'll discover that it was something wildly different from, you know, whatever other historical examples they immediately want to liken it to and put it in these kind of untouchable barrels. Like, I like your point about everything is so subtle, truly. Everything is so nuanced and so subtle, so complex and so unresolvable that it's just like, it's complete foolishness to just be like, "Oh, I know what that is. Nope, that's untouchable." It's like, "No, you don't. You don't you don't know what it is. It's a completely fresh occurrence that's never occurred before. Maybe it matches some patterns, and I'm not saying we can't do any pattern matching, but, you know, holding the unknowing and holding the complexity and holding the openness that, okay, we're seeing something we've never seen before. Maybe there's maybe there's good and bad aspects of this. Can we, like, not leap to immediately collapsing it down to some kind of known reality? Can we hold space for emergence and strangeness? Yeah.
Really well put. Yeah, I mean, that is the whirlpool that we're in. Strangeness, novelty, new emergence, transformation, and not only what's happening, but the space within which what's happening is occurring is changing. Our consciousness is changing. So all of this has to be taken into account. And as you say, if we're becoming fixated on this one vision of what it is, we're not going to be honoring the true, like, flow of complexity and novelty that's occurring. And it's the same thing in your own life. Like, if you have a new relationship come in and it triggers some trauma pattern, you may well be like that's the exact same thing as I experienced there. And it might bear out a lot in common with it. And you might need to be very discerning and cautious about it too. But there's also bound to be something new, something that needs a question mark, something that needs a degree of openness and curiosity about what's unfolding. So, at the minimum, um, we should be honoring that. And with respect to the points you raised, there's so much historical narrative that goes into even approaching that question. And if you've spent the last 10 years in a world of like, America is fundamentally evil, America is foundationally evil, that's been a historical narrative that's been propagated a lot. Um, then you'd probably want to celebrate the decline and downfall of the United States. But if you have a different historical narrative where you kind of like Robert F. Kennedy's campaign, like see all the shadows, see the CIA toppling governments, see this dark side, see this deep state, but also see like a goodness and a fundamental goodness and a possibility of renewal, then actually you're likely to actually want America to, continue to turn towards finding its inner greatness and realizing that. Um, and so again, like we need to have a space to inquire into the background and not just look at the symptom and like what's showing up on the surface. Because underneath that iceberg is like, I have a belief in America and I have a faith in America, and the other person doesn't have any faith in America and is like rooted in a viewpoint of, um, it would be better if this country declined and crumbled. And therefore, why would you want this like kind of intense iron willed surgery to come in and change it? Um, these are all questions that have to be asked, and we need space to ask them. And iron willed men can reform the world in radical and positive ways, and they can also destroy and corrupt the world in very dangerous and destructive ways. And I think we mostly lean on the side of fear of having seen the destructive side of the iron-willed man than we do of recognizing sometimes the necessity and power of the iron-willed man to shake things up and transform things for the better.
Yeah, really well said. I mean, interestingly, I'm reminded of Osho. I don't know if you're very familiar with Osho, but Osho, the spiritual teacher and spiritual leader who became a very controversial figure, and there were controversies around his personal life and potential abuses of his position, and yet many people to this day consider Osho an extremely inspiring figure, a figure who did quite incredible things, creating, a community in Oregon with tens of thousands of people living there and kind of exploring the edges of what was possible for humanity. And many people are deeply inspired by Osho's talks, and there's a lot of wisdom in there. And he embodies the trickster, and he can't be easily pinned down as like, oh, he was just a bad guy, or like, oh, he was just a good guy. He was all of it, and he was a force of nature. And when I look at someone like Trump, I see something similar there. I see a trickster and a force of nature. And in a way, I see this in every human being. We're all forces of nature, and we're all of it, and we're all tricksters, whether or not we're aware of that and embodying that. But we're all these kind of mirrors where, like Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil cuts right through our heart. Runs through the heart of every human being. And, a lot of people, they want to look at some of Trump's past transgressions as a human being, which, I'm fully in favor of holding human beings accountable for their transgressions. And, I don't know the full extent of what Trump has done in his life, but, a lot of it looks pretty shady and questionable. And I've seen clips of him doing things that I find shady and bullying and, borderline abusive and questionable for sure. And yet people want to look at that and just say, that's the evidence that this is just a bad egg, a bad person, and nothing good could ever come from this person. And to me, that's just so much more of a boring way to look at reality. It's like, yeah, that's that you're taking the easy way out of just collapsing complexity into a very simple category of like, yeah, there's just good people and bad people, and he's just a bad one, and anything he does is bad, and I'm not open to any possibility that there could be anything good coming from this guy. I think a much more interesting way to look at it is, he's a human being, and like you and me, he's got skeletons in his closet, and he has virtues, and he's a trickster figure. I mean, he often seems like a stand-up comedian. You can never be quite sure how seriously to take some of the stuff he does, when he's posting "Long live the king." It's like, is he just trolling everybody? Like, is he just doing that because he knows that a lot of people are gonna be really triggered by that? Who knows? Who knows, And yeah, I mean, similar with Musk doing that vague kind of like arm raise that people interpreted as a possible, um, you know, indication of some kind of anti-Semitic allegiance. It's like people want to take something like that that is kind of like an ambiguous meme that could be a strange troll by a kind of, middle-aged trickster, and they want to just take that and collapse all the complexity down to like, look, Musk is bad. He's shown his true colors, just condemn him. And it's like, Musk has done so much in his life. He built the largest electric car company in the world. He, you know, has just been generally an emblem of innovation and the human spirit of pioneering, manifesting unthinkable creation. It's just, yeah, I just think we cannot, these figures don't collapse neatly down into black and white categories. And the real story, the real complexity is much more fascinating to me, much more fascinated by that complexity. And I find it much more like humanly relatable and humanly interesting because I'm a complex character too. And, you know, I've seen myself do things in my life that I'm not proud of, and I think we all have. And when we can start acknowledging that, then reality opens up into something more fascinating.
Yeah. Wow. Amen. This is a point that I was already like moving in me over the last few days. So I'm really glad that you took the time to include it here. Um, yeah, it seems to me that greatness um, of contribution in the world almost always comes with mixed character, and the more uh, intensity with which we are like bringing it forward, whether it's like rock star musician or CEO or whatever it is, it's almost like the shadow parts that are there are going to get amplified and demonstrated even more because we're moving with more velocity, because we're moving at more scale, because we have more influence and power. Those shadow parts also, can manifest with more influence and power. Um, I want to honor the wound that a lot of people, particularly women, feel in relationship to these kind of male figures of power who abuse that power sexually. I think that's just in the background, and that's the whole Me Too energy is like these motherfuckers, like these Harvey Weinstein type people. And gosh, like, can we have compassion for Harvey Weinstein? I don't know. It's tricky because a depth of faith in God and the sacred means that nobody is beyond redemption. Nobody is cast into the hellfire. Even the biggest abuser of history is never like, there's always like a 0.1% of of the possibility of redemption that we hold towards them. I think that's the essence of the value that we take from from most world religions. Um, and so we're kind of caught in a bit of a tricky spot when we have these characters who seem to have fairly consolidated personalities, who seem to have shown their colors over years and years. Like, um, I'm not one of the people who kind of just offhand say Trump is a rapist. Like, I'm not throwing that accusation around, but clearly there's like a lot of just like domineering, kind of handsy type, like 1980s fraternity house type attitudes, right? And a lot of women are kind of sick of that and wounded around that and trying to move beyond that. So when they see someone who they see as like exemplifying that shadow in power, then there's a lot of intense negative affect. But as you're pointing to, and as I'll say again, people can have profoundly positive contributions and be deeply flawed. And can we hold those two things together? And if we can do that, starting with ourselves, right? As you pointed to, like, in some ways, the closer I come to Christ, the closer I come to like recognizing and bringing forth my own, more shadowy sides. But can we hold the two together, and can we hold a space where it's like, no, well, yeah, this person has a side that is X, but they also have this profoundly positive contribution as well. Can we hold them two together? Can we hold the complexity of it? Jordan Peterson is the case in point. That man has profoundly impacted thousands, if not millions, of men and women around the world. He's conveyed ancient wisdoms in a way that the culture had completely failed to. I regularly find myself bumping into a really valuable heuristic or tool, a way of understanding, like, oh, taking courageous steps in reality, but finding ways to do it like little by little. This kind of like psychological archetypal insight that he conveyed more than anybody else has become essential parts of my understanding of how the world works. And, at the same time, I see all the shadow. I see how he behaves on Twitter. I see this like really like nasty side of him that comes out in various contexts, right? So, and I'm holding them both together. And I think that's the invitation. And that's what it's going to take is to hold the shadows and hold the positive qualities together stereoscopically within a sacred context, and to catch ourselves if we're just like Elon, my hero, like, and not seeing, okay, this dude is incredibly powerful and power has a capacity to corrupt people. Or if we're just like, oh, he's evil because he's just a fucking wealthy male global powerhouse and dominating and taking over all this shit. Like, no, he's a man with heart and vision, and he's articulated that in many contexts and shown actually a care to show up and serve in certain respects, and has a vision for advancing humanity. So let's hold it all together.
Yeah, Steve Jobs was another one who came to mind.
Yeah, right.
Another
Kind
great
of an asshole
example. Yeah.
personally to a lot of people. Usually these guys are bad, have some issues with their relationships, or they're not that great with their kids. Like, it just seems to be the case that if you're gonna be a fucking world-changing innovator, that you're gonna leave some mess in terms of your personal relationships. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I wouldn't assume it has to be that way. I'd like to move toward a space where it feels like with deeper integration, deeper alchemization, and deeper men's work, perhaps, that we could actually move toward
Right.
a space where there's more capacity to be you know, the solar energetic single pointed force of great impact in the world while simultaneously maintaining, you know, beautiful, harmonious relationships and bringing that level of skillfulness. And I mean, that's just, but not necessarily. And I'm not saying everyone needs to become that or everyone needs to aspire to that. But I do think there's a place here to talk about inner work and the possibility that deeper inner work could result in, you know, more figures who are more along the lines of Christ, for example, who had an unimaginable world-changing impact and, you know, I mean, sure, he was flipping over tables in the temple and stuff, but seemingly had, like, alchemized and integrated the anger and the shadow in a way where it could just be, like, skillfully applied, in a situation where it would be useful, where it would be useful. Um, the other piece that came up for me too was just how these qualities cannot be pulled apart. Like the the exact things that people hate about different powerful figures or decry in them, very often those are deeply connected to their capacity to do the impactful and good things that they've done, like a disregard for normal rules or a tendency to test boundaries or a tendency to, be forceful in their way of being. If they weren't like that, they
Mm,
wouldn't be able to do the things that they're doing. So again, we reality reveals itself as much more complex than people want to make it, and the yin and yang reveal themselves as, inextricably intertwined. And yeah, and for me, it just feels a lot more interesting to meditate on that. And yeah, for many people, it's probably troubling to consider things like that. Like, oh, that person's inner devils and inner angels are somehow profoundly intertwined, and you wouldn't have the angelic effects of the person without their inner devil being somehow like an engine that is connected to what has driven them to actualize something. And it was interesting the comment you made about as you get closer to Christ, you find you're confronting your shadows, or your shadows are coming forth more fully. And yeah, I think that speaks to what I'm getting at with the inner work piece around, like, there being an opportunity here as we start to come closer to what could be called the light of Christ, or we open to the heart of hearts. We discover more love and more space that actually allows us to confront the shadow with ever greater depth, because we actually have the space to hold that. We have the space of self compassion required to see that all the shadows of humanity are inside of us, and be able to actually hold that and work with that and begin to digest that and begin to alchemize that and hold those shadows in the love that can allow them to gradually set down their burdens and reharmonize with the whole and integrate. But it's not it's not for the faint of heart. It's not easy. It's a deep journey.
mm. And there's no shortcut, there's no shotgun on that kind of work. Um, I just wanted to add a caveat to what we were exploring before, which is, we've mostly spoken about examples that are projected onto by progressives, people like Jordan Peterson and Donald Trump and so Elon Musk. But the counter woke and the right also have their versions of this, and you can think of people like Bill Gates, for example. Like, Bill Gates was held up as this like saintly, incredible philanthropic figure, and then there was like this ripping off of veils and getting to this point where it's like, is this guy in this kind of like Epstein Island demonic shadow globalist thing, and are all these philanthropic enterprises actually like kind of covert ways for building and accumulating more power and wealth? And so, and also, you can think of Anthony Fauci as somebody who was considered like a liberal, saintly figure. And then on the right is like, actually all the masks are being ripped off. And this person is like this shadowy, dark figure, right? So, the challenge I kind of propose there is like, can somebody who's more disposed to the right hold that same posture with relation to a Bill Gates and like, yeah, maybe he's more sinister than libs think, but maybe there's also some significant good that he's done as well. And can we hold the complexity together? Um, I really love where you've brought this. What was coming for me is the sense of like the gift, the shadow, and the wound are all like very, very close together, and need to be understood in that way. I think your vision of these kinds of leaders being held within men's workspaces, for example, is incredibly important. Um, I remember in Brotherhood Circle a long while back when we are talking about if Donald Trump had to do the King's Chair exercise and have his brothers around him be like, Donald Trump, I don't see you as a king because, and just like give you all this pointed, like direct feedback and like be in a space where you have to receive that. Um, and, a lot of these guys have had huge success in corporate life or politics or law or these different fields where you don't necessarily have that quality of like brotherly commitment to deep introspection and self work and bringing out the different parts together. So, um, equally, I think the fact that many of these leaders have not worked deeply with plant medicine and therefore had that humbling encounter with the divine feminine in these medicines, Jordan Peterson included, I think that's really relevant. So, um, the possibility of creating context to hold these like flawed and excellently driven leaders in a way that kind of aspires to deeper integration and deeper understanding and holds kind of like sacred space alongside public life. Because a lot of these guys, it seems to me, are just outworking their shit, using their platforms, using Twitter and using that kind of thing. Um, and it's not clear to me that Elon Musk or Jordan Peterson or Donald Trump is participating in any kind of sacred community space where the wholeness of them is honored and brought forward with any consistency. And I think that would be a big deal, and that would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I love that. Just like turning the whole world into a sacred space where we're holding space for everyone's wholeness and holding space and holding the highest hopes for every being, holding the highest hopes for every being to integrate and to discover that deeper redemption that you spoke to, and that possibility of redemption that's latent for all beings. And yeah, and it's right here, right now, and in a sense, in a profound sense, I would say we're all already redeemed, and it's just kind of a matter of remembering that that redemption is already the case in a certain sense. Um, I want to give you the last word in a moment if there's anything you want to end with. Before I do that, I just wanted to note a couple quotes that came to mind at some point in our conversation. For one, Christ saying, "Love thy enemies." You touched on loving one's enemies earlier, and I think that that's a great signpost to take away from this conversation, and a great challenge to everyone who, the figures that trigger you most, that is
Mhm.
where the deepest work lies for you. Can you find compassion? Can you find love for those figures? Can you authentically, you know, put yourself in their position or discover the way in which you are them in a profound sense? And that's, a journey and practice of a lifetime. Like, I certainly won't claim to be perfect at that, and I'll be practicing it for the rest of my life, to love and forgive those who have hurt me, those who have hurt people I love, and those who I don't agree with on a world stage that seem questionable. But, that's the real work. And the other quote that came to mind, I think this was by the Zen master Song Song. He said, "The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease." And yeah, I feel that there's something really, really profound being pointed to there, where he's almost saying, you know, the way the human mind or the thinking mind works has this inherent polarization that can easily and often does turn into this kind of war consciousness where we're just so convinced of what we should be for and what we should be against. And the nuance here is that it's not to say that we're never meant to take a stand in life, you know? I think that can be a shadow of this kind of centrist quantum epistemology, holding all of it thing is like you lack the capacity to really take a strong stand against something evil or something like that. And so it's a delicate balance here. I think we should retain the classical masculine capacity to take a strong stand when it is called for. And at the same time, there's this transcendent space that we need to be able to access as a culture that, it's kind of like the Rumi quote, out beyond ideas of right and wrong. There's a meadow. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. And it's this space of transcendence where the world itself is seen as this unified tapestry, and none of the different threads can be pulled apart. They're all woven into this dance, this interbeing, and and you just, from that transcendent place, you see that in a profound sense, it's reality just is. In a profound sense, reality just is. Or from that view, it's almost like reality looks like a transcendent artwork that's just kind of doing its thing, and there's so much nuance and so much complexity, and it can't be collapsed down into any simple category. It's just this hyper tapestry of artistry, and from that place it starts to look kind of absurd to be like, oh well, I'm really, in favor of these threads in the tapestry, but I'm really against these threads in the tapestry. And I wish I could just rip those threads out and we could just strongly prioritize these threads. And it's like, well, but it's a tapestry and it all goes together. And it's that space of revelation of the wholeness and the way it all goes together. I feel is what Song was pointing to with that quote. And so I think there is a possibility to transcend and include, where we still include the capacity to take a stand in accordance with our dharma, in accordance with our values, when there's a moment to do that, and yet we have access to this transcendent space that really affirms all of reality in all of its tragicomic and gorgeous, terrible complexity, in all of its unimaginable pain and unimaginable joy. It's this revelatory moment where we just see, wow, it is breathtakingly astounding in all of its full Shakespearean, Dostoevskian complexity. And God is writing a novel of epic magnitude, and it would be impoverished if we just vacuum sucked all of the dynamism out of it and we just turned it into, all of us are just holding hands singing Kumbaya for all of eternity. That's not nearly as fascinating and rich and astonishing of a story as what is being woven in this cosmos. So yeah, that's the place I felt to bring it to. And if you have any concluding statements, brother, that you want to leave the people with, please do.
Yeah, I think that that kind of novelistic consciousness is really helpful here, because the best novels hold so much of the complexity of life, and even the villainous characters sometimes have a role to play in the unfolding of a greater story of goodness. And there's just nuance. There's a nuance of understanding of the human life that comes from engaging with, things like Dostoevsky novels and these complex, rich stories that actually reflect back life. And, to an extent that's less clear to me, I think probably engaging with scripture and religious texts also can reveal that complexity to us. Um, I think that's what's come through for me in this dialogue is kind of soulful response to polarization. And it feels like that's the level at which it has to be addressed and understood. And um, the kind of humility that comes from really, really not knowing what's going on is quite important here. The amazing teachers of plant medicine are really big in this perspective, and very often teach us to, like, you might go through a little phase in the lead up of your psychedelic plant medicine journey of like super thinking about all the polarization and like I know what's going on and it's all fucked and this is going on in my relationships. But then there's kind of a place that you get to beyond all of that, and you come away from that, with a kind of wholeness and also a kind of not knowing. Um just like, we don't really know how all these pieces are playing together, how it's really going to unfold, what this person's destiny may or may not turn out to be. And that soul perspective for me finally is also one of going beyond just this lifetime and understanding that people can lead a life that is profoundly dark, sinister, sinful, and their soul then continues after death to journey on. And, people can take that or leave that, but that's something that I'm starting to entertain metaphysically. And what that perspective does for me is as like, that person who is so fixed in your mind as like the abusive father or the genocidal dictator, so captured by these dark forces greater than themselves. Even those people crossed the threshold of the veil of this reality and went through a process of revelation of who they really were and what was really going on, and probably go on a journey of unpacking and healing that until they reveal that, some kind of purer essence of those people's souls is revealed as well. So if we can kind of relate to that possibility, I think it can help a lot. And finally, the balance I want to strike is like, yeah, this person has showed patent behavior for a long time, and we need to be discerning and boundaried around that. But there is this gem of redemption. Christianity brings some of that. I'm also thinking about that amazing AI video of Donald Trump drinking ayahuasca and like purging out all of his greed and his parental trauma and all of this shit and having these revelations. And for me, that was kind of like an expression of a quantum potential in the collective consciousness. And even if it never ever comes to be, it's just like that sense of this thing you think is so fixed isn't as fixed as you think. And even somebody like a Donald, like, we have to be open to the possibility, even if it's a grain of sand in the sea of divinity, that someone like a Donald Trump, someone like a Bill Gates, someone like an Elon Musk can have a radical revelation and shift in perspective on their journey. And when we hold that for them, I think we make it slightly more possible, and not in a naive kind of like way, but still, I think it's important to hold that. So for our enemies in particular.
Mm. Yeah, beautifully said. I love that. And is there anywhere people can find out more about your work, brother? Any links you want to drop to breadcrumbs?
Yeah, I think the two main places to reach me would be my Substack, Culture Pilgrim, and the Substack of my men's work, The Resonant Man. Those are the two bases. I'm currently redesigning and renovating my website, so I'll pause on sharing that for now.
Awesome. And Sense Space here on YouTube is,
That's right.
yeah, your YouTube channel as well. So, all right. Well, thank you, brother. It's been a beautiful journey of a conversation. I'm really happy with that we had this. Uh,
Thank you.